Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our ADA Basics webinar. Our presenter today is Danny Broxson, and our panelist is Cherie Hoffman. Cherie is with the ADA Distance Learning with the she's an ADA Distance Learning and Training Director with the Southeast ADA Center. And then Danny is our Independent Living Specialist and Peer Counselor. So together they're going to be presenting this webinar, and we hope you enjoy it. And if you have any questions, please hold them till the end. You're welcome to type them into the chat box so that we can field them easily at the end of the presentation. Thank you for your cooperation, and please put your mic on mute until the end for our Q&A session. Thank you again, and enjoy the presentation.
Thank you, Joanne. And as we start the presentation, I just want to remind you that this is a very ADA basics. So we're going to go over a lot of overview information, touch on all 5 of the titles of the ADA, but this is a very basic presentation just to kind of get you interested, maybe some thought-provoking questions. And I want to start with a thought-provoking question and kind of help you to put things into perspective. So if you go to the next slide. The question is, how many people with disability age 18 and older currently live in the United States? And the answer is, if we go to the next slide, is 85.3 million people, or 27.2% of the US population. Now, like I said, I just wanted to give you that statistic to kind of put things in perspective when we talk about people with disabilities. So who has rights under the ADA or the Americans with Disabilities Act? These are people who have disabilities or have a record of or regarded as having a disability, or I should say, and have an association with a person with a disability. And as you can see, there is our definition of what is a disability: a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activity. So we're going to talk about all 5 of the titles of the ADA, and you could read those. Title 1 is employment. Title 2 talks about the accessibility in public entities. Title 3 is accessibility in businesses. Title 4 is telecommunications. And Title 5 is miscellaneous. We're going to touch on each one of these. So if you have questions, like Joanne said, you can type it into the chat box. Just hold those till the end, and then we'll take all those questions as we talk about each one and we go into more depth. But I want to start out with a little bit of the history of the ADA and some of the significant things that happen along the way as we get here today. So we're going to call this A Journey Through Time, Disability Rights and Legislation. So I don't know how many of you know, and maybe some of you do, know what the Smith-Hughes Act is and when it was passed. Okay. The correct answer to this question is in 1917. 1917, the Smith-Hughes Act was passed to create a unified program in vocational rehabilitation, included responsibility for veterans with disabilities. So I know we talk about the ADA and history of the ADA, but interestingly, our first significant disability legislation emerged from World War I. This was to deal with the soldiers that were coming back from World War I with disabilities. Next slide. What was the 1927 Buck versus Bell Supreme Court decision. And as you can see, the correct answer, it ruled that forced sterilization of people with disabilities was not against their constitutional rights. Okay, this question focuses on the fact that the general public has not always been supportive of how and when people with disabilities should be involved in their communities. So interestingly, as we were passing legislation to ensure service members with disabilities would be integrated into society, we're also talking about the sterilization of people with disabilities, which is based on the idea, the eugenics movement was based on the idea, anyone who does not meet society's definition of quote unquote normal should be separated from society and not be allowed to have children. The eugenics movement maintained that with people with disabilities represented flawed genetic stock and should be removed from human gene pool through sterilization. In 1927, forced sterilization of people with disabilities was upheld by the Supreme Court as not a violation of their constitutional rights. We go to the next slide. So when was forced sterilization of people with disabilities, when did that stop? And if you had to guess, you probably wouldn't guess, because as I was reading this and studying for this presentation, I was shocked to find out that forced sterilizations did not end until 1979. It was still legal to take away people's ability to have children against their will, quote unquote, for their own good. And if you ever just want to Google the eugenics movement and forced sterilization, it's a pretty amazing, there's a lot of information out there. It's pretty amazing to read it. Next slide. Okay, this is Ed Roberts, and I don't know how many of you know who Ed Roberts is, but Ed Roberts is huge in the disability movement. In 1962, he gained admission into the University of California after winning a lawsuit. And Ed Roberts, he co-founded the independent living movement and had to sue to gain admission to college. The University of California refused to admit him as a student, despite the fact that he was qualified, maintaining that his refusal was, again, quote unquote, for his own good. College admission officials maintained that it would not be safe for Mr. Roberts to attend college. There's also a lot of good material on Ed Roberts. Just as a side, 60 Minutes did a wonderful piece on him several years ago. You could probably Google that or find that on YouTube. But that presentation was awesome. As we continue our journey through time, disability rights legislation, we're going to talk a little bit about the Rehabilitation Act and when that was passed. And that was passed in 1973. The Rehabilitation Act was originally passed by Congress actually in 1972, but was vetoed by then President Nixon. The original Rehabilitation Act prohibited the discrimination in the federal government, but not in society as a whole. This legislation was important because it laid the groundwork for the ADA. Next slide. And here we see a picture of the largest sit-in or the longest sit-in ever conducted as a U.S. federal building in 1977. The U.S. Secretary of Health and Education of Welfare refused to sign the regulations for the Rehabilitation Act. This was important because without regulations, the law was not enforceable. So at this point, many people did not even realize that the disability community has been engaged in a significant civil rights movement in our country. Next slide. And here we see a picture, and this is the entire spirit of the ADA. This is the passing, the signing of the bill, passing the legislation into law. And these are some quotes by some very significant people who made that happen. The ADA is the Civil Rights Act of the future, and that's Dustin Dart Jr., founder of the ADA. And President Bush at the time said that the world's first comprehensive declaration of equality for people with disabilities. Next slide. And I think you all know at this point that we are getting ready to celebrate 30 years of the ADA as of July 26th, 2020. And a lot of people think that when this law was passed, that would be the end of it, everybody would be great. But the ADA was further strengthened in 2008 when the ADA Amendments Act was passed in response to several Supreme Court decisions that weakened the law by placing narrow restrictions on who could be given protections by the law. So this is an ongoing issue, this is an ongoing legislation, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. Next slide shows a timeline of legislative action related to people with disabilities. But I want to focus on a couple of these. I don't want to read all of these, but I want to focus on the first one because in 1964, the Civil Rights Act, the big Civil Rights Act that everyone talks about, ironically did not include anything having to do with a disability. So if you look from 1964 to the bottom of that list, 2008, the ADA Amendments Act was signed into law. We're talking about a significant amount of time and a lot of legislation in between. So I want you to focus on a couple of these things. Fair housing is important for all people with disabilities. Fair housing is important to everybody, but significant for people with disabilities. You also have the Carrier Act, which relates to flying and travel. But it's ironic that the Americans with Disabilities Act was not passed. If you look at that whole long list, it wasn't passed until 1990. And then significant changes were made in 2008. We're talking about an 18-year difference. So I would say that the struggle is real. The legislation is enforceable, of course, but I just wanted to point out that timeline that these are significant pieces of legislation. And like I said, the struggle for equality for people with disabilities has been real and significant over the course of that time. Next slide. So does the ADA apply? That's the question. That's the question that we all get when we answer calls and people say, oh, I have a disability. So does the ADA apply? Next slide. Who is covered or who must comply with the ADA? Okay, entities with 15 or more employees for Title I employment of the ADA. Or public agencies or government agencies, regardless of whether they receive federal assistance for Title II of the ADA. Privately operated commercial entities, for example, private schools and colleges, banks, restaurants, theaters, hotels, private transportation, supermarkets, shopping malls, museums, recreational facilities, sports arenas, medical, legal, and insurance offices for Title III of the ADA. And those that are exempt are private clubs and religious organizations. Okay, we looked at some of these before. as we talked about the titles of the ADA. Title I, if you remember, is employment. Basically prohibits the discrimination or disability discrimination in all employment process. Title II is the accessibility in public entities, physical and program accessibility in state, local government entities. Title III, accessibility in business, physical and program accessibility in restaurants, hotels, stores, places of business. Title IV is telecommunications, accessibility of telephone and communication systems for the public. And Title V is miscellaneous, protection from retaliation. Okay, so let's go back to Title I and discuss that in a little more detail. Employers cannot discriminate against people who have disabilities in regard to any employment practices or terms, conditions, or privileges of employment. This prohibition covers all aspects of employment process. Next slide. An employer cannot discriminate against qualified applicants and employees on the basis of disability. A qualified applicant is an individual who meets the skill, experience, education, and other job-related requirements of the position held or desired with or without reasonable accommodation and can perform the essential functions of the job. Okay, that's important. Reasonable accommodation and can perform the essential functions of the job. Next slide. So let's look at a particular case. And in this case, Naomi applies for a job. Now, Naomi is visually impaired. She applies for a job at a large department store. While completing the application, she discovers there's a question asking if she has a disability. Number one, is this situation covered under the Title I of the ADA? And the answer is yes, of course. This situation is covered under Title I employment provisions. And remember, it's all provisions, all aspects. So under the ADA, employers are not allowed to ask a job applicant if they have a disability or any question that would require them to disclose a possible disability or health condition. Now, employers may ask, are you able to perform the essential functions of the job with or without reasonable accommodation? This question calls for a simple yes or no response. Job applicants who believe they will be able to do the essential functions, even if they require an accommodation to do so, should appropriately respond yes, no discussion or disclosure of disability is required unless and until an accommodation is made. Or accommodation request, I should say. Next slide. Title II, state and local governments, prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability in the services, programs, and activities of all state and local government entities. Okay, and there's some subtitle A is state and local government, and subtitle B is public transportation. So all of that is covered under Title II. Next slide. Okay, if we look at our other case study, this is Nina and the bus. Nina is an individual who is deaf and uses the city's fixed route bus system. She's frustrated because the bus driver consistently announces the bus stops, but there is no visual method for her to know when her stop is coming. This makes it more difficult for Nina to independently find her way to her destination. And the question again, is the situation covered under the ADA? And again, the answer is yes, this is covered under Title II of the ADA. Title II of the ADA concerns programs and services offered by state and local municipalities. Public transportation is covered. While the Department of Justice enforces Title II, in most situations, the case of public transportation, the Department of Transportation or the DOT oversees implementation of the ADA. Either way, the point is that we're covered under the ADA. Next slide. Let's move into Title III, places of public accommodation and commercial facilities or private businesses. Title III prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability in the activities of places of public accommodation. Businesses that are generally open to the public and fall into one of 12 categories listed in the ADA, such as restaurants, movie theaters, schools, daycare facilities, recreational facilities, and doctor's offices, and require newly constructed or altered places of public accommodation, as well as commercial facilities, privately owned non-residential facilities such as factories, warehouses, or other buildings must comply with the ADA standards. So we have another case study. John goes into a restaurant. He went into a restaurant, a popular restaurant. A coworker suggested, John is a wheelchair user. When he arrived, it seemed accessible from the parking lot to the door, even to his table. When it came time to leave, he needed to use the restroom. He asked the server where it was. The server pointed to the back of the restaurant. When John finally got down a narrow hallway to the restroom, he realized he would not be able to access the restroom due to the steps. Is this situation covered under the ADA? And of course, based on our discussion, you know that the answer is yes. This situation is covered under Title III of the ADA. Restaurants are one of the 12 types of establishments referred to as places of public accommodation under the law. Businesses that serve the public must ensure that the goods and services they provide are accessible to customers with disabilities. I'm going to throw out a few more statistics for you on this, because more than 50 million Americans, or 18% of the population, have a disability, and each is a potential customer. People with disabilities are living more independently, particularly more actively in the communities. They and their families want to patronize those businesses and be welcome as customers with disabilities. Okay, when we look at the baby boomers, we're talking about 71.5 million baby boomers will be over the age of 65 by the year 2030. And will be demanding products, services, environments that meet their age-related physical needs. Studies show that people with disabilities, once they find a business they can shop or get service in an accessible manner, they become repeat customers. So what should John do? John should approach the management with the positive aspects of their accessibility, but also make sure to point out the need to update the inaccessible path of travel to the restroom, and subsequently this inability to even enter it. Title IV is telecommunications, and the term telecommunications relay service means telephone transmission services that provide the ability for individuals who have hearing impairment or speech impairment to engage in communication by wire or radio with a hearing individual in a manner that is functionally equivalent to the ability of an individual who does not have a hearing impairment or speech impairment to communicate using voice communication services by wire or radio. And that's a picture of our FTRI program. That's Karen Jackson, who's helping a person get a telephone. And this particular individual got a phone, and she also was able to use that phone in her place of business to help her perform the essential functions of her job. So that's a wonderful story in and of itself right there. Next slide. Now, Title V is miscellaneous. And like I said, there's a lot to the ADA. There's many facets to it, and everything's kind of done on a case-by-case basis. And this is just a general overview, just kind of to wet your whistle and pique your interest. But Title V is miscellaneous, okay? It requires the Access Board to issue accessibility standards. It also allows for attorney's fees to be awarded to prevailing parties in suits filed under the ADA. There's usually not any monetary gain for filing a lawsuit and winning a lawsuit, but at least the attorney's fees can be paid. Requires federal agencies to provide technical assistance. State specifically that illegal use of drugs is not a covered disability. So that's not covered by the ADA. And provides that the state and local law that mandate equal or greater protection to individuals with disabilities are not superseded or limited by the ADA. So they want to be able to provide extra coverage or making sure that things are covered under the ADA. Next slide. Now these are some additional resources. Of course, the CIL disability resource is always a resource for somebody who needs to know more about the ADA or has an ADA question. The Southeast ADA Center is a wonderful resource, and that's somebody that we use to get the definitive ADA answer to. And also the Department of Justice, you can find them at ada.gov, has wonderful, wonderful information as far as if you needed to file a complaint or file a pro se lawsuit. So those are just some great resources. Of course, there are others, and you would probably get other websites specific to different if you were to look deeper into the ADA as it relates to employment, you know, there's other websites and different things that deal specifically with job accommodation and different sites that you could use and get information that you needed. So next slide. Of course, you can contact us. That's all of our contact information, and that will be made available to you if you don't already have that information. But if you want to go to the next slide, that's our disclaimer. And now it's time for questions. So if you have any specific questions or any thoughts that you might have, you can go ahead and ask those questions now. We can open up the mic if you have a question, if you want to raise your hand.
This is John. I actually have a couple, actually.
Okay.
So my question is, at one point you said there were 50, you used the 84 million people figure, and then you used the 50 million figure. So I was wondering what the difference is between those figures.
Okay. So, and you have to remember, some of those statistics are, we got those statistics from different sources.
Yeah.
The,
You said that was the same number of people. So the first one you said was 84 million, and then you said 50 million people. So I'm just wondering.
right. I can go back and double check those. But the 85 million came from a specific source
Okay.
in 2014.
Okay.
Okay. So I can go back and double check those sources for you and make sure that we get an accurate number. But that number, like I said, that number is always changing because we also, remember, we have a lot of those baby boomers that are coming up. And that's going to skew the numbers just based on as they age and need different things related to their aging, things that they may not even think that applies to disability, or may not even think of it as a disability.
And
So,
then my other question is when it applies to jobs, it says you mentioned other duties. I would imagine that would be where it would be kind of leery, because the employer could say, well, you can do everything else, but maybe you can't do the other parts that because it said other you know other tasks of the job. So some language in there was vague as far as, I mean, not that you were vague, but the language is vague. So it
right.
seemed like there could be a lot of loopholes in there to be caught under.
Well, I can get Cherie to answer the technical part of that, but if I was to answer that question, I would say that, of course, you would look at the job description that you're applying for, and you would know right away that either you would or would not be able to perform the essential functions of the job.
No,
However,
I'm saying the employer would say that you couldn't. I'm saying.
Right. So if they add other functions that you're not capable of, that would be a discussion that you would have with the employer, but you probably would not have to have that discussion unless and until a job offer was made, and until a job accommodation request would have to be made. So you may be able to perform the essential functions of the job, but if they add X, Y, and Z, that would be a perfect time for you to go in and ask for an accommodation, and you're perfectly, within your legal rights to do that. So,
and then also, as far as that goes, do you have a time frame that you? I mean, I know that you don't have to ever disclose, but I mean, if you wait till too long and then you say, 3 months down the line that you have a disability, they might say, well, you didn't tell us in enough time, So
I'm going to defer that question to Cherie, because I seem to remember going through some other things, and there was actually a time frame for that, but I'm not. I may be thinking of something else. Cherie, can you answer that question?
There's time frames for filing a complaint. So there are people that can work 10, 15 years without ever asking for an accommodation, and then their disability may get worse, let's say, or something adds to it, that the essential function has now become a more difficult function to do, and they need, let's say that their vision has worsened and they need a larger screen so that they can be able to use Zoom text. But there are people that go years and years and years and never need any accommodation, but they really are defined as a person with a disability, but then all of a sudden they do. But then there's people that take a job, and in the back of their head, they're saying, I can do this, I'm qualified, but I know I'm going to need that that Plantronics headset to be able to hear on the phone, or I know that I'm going to need an accessible pathway to the lunchroom, or anything of that nature. You do not need to disclose that at interview. Some interviews are so they're done on the websites now, and sometimes I think it's really good because an employer can't visually see that person and they don't know that that person has a disability. A really good webinar that I attended a while back was social media and employment, and how people need to be more careful about what they put on social media, because actually employers are Googling applicants these days and they're getting the feel for it right away. Oh, that person has a disability, and they don't even want to go to the interview stage with them. You'd never be able to prove it. But the long and short of it is there's no time limit to disclosure. There's no time limit to when you need it.
So yeah, I have another question that it's probably more directed toward you. Is like when he was talking about before, he was talking about all those key people that we all know as far as the leadership in the disability movement. Who would you say that we still have those today? Those types of people today? I mean, I mean, I hear a lot about issues, but I don't feel like there's a cohesion. Like when every time I hear the stories about the 70s and all these great people, and I've heard all those before, but I don't feel like there's a cohesion of those type of, like I couldn't pick out names today of those people that are doing that. I know the CIL does that, and you know, in broad spectrum, but are there actual well-known people that are those advocates today that have kind of taken the mantle of those people?
Well, I can take that one too, Danny, and I can tell you, yes, they're there. In a more professional sense now, because we've gone from the we can't go stage and the crowd, the steps, and the movement itself. We now have researchers, and I know it sounds, researchers, but we've got people out there that are still supporting the rights of people with disabilities. They're still capacity building. This is why Danny is here today, because he is building your capacity to be able to go back out into the community. If you wanted a job or you know somebody who needed one, you're going to go and say, gee, you need to talk to the CIL before you do that. The whole idea is, when the miscellaneous provisions came out, this is an interesting facet to that. When President Bush put his ink to that law, he said, I will never have another civil rights law go out there where there isn't somebody out there training people. And that's how actually the Southeast ADA Center and the other 9 ADA centers around the United States were born. They were born through that miscellaneous provision. So they said, we're going to go ahead and give them 5 years to go out there and build the capacity of the CILs and all the other agencies like the United Cerebral Palsy and the Easter Seals and the epilepsy societies. Well, what happened was they found a trend. The ADA centers were doing a good job, but there was so much transferring of jobs and people within those other organizations that the ADA centers are still here 30 years later, still building the capacity, still out there working with Danny and Joanne and Susan and the assistive technology centers and building that capacity so that you can take it back out into the community. So we're there, and there are quite a few people at the university levels that are starched advocates. I can tell you something about the Southeast ADA Center, though. They're not an enforcement agency, and they do not enforce the ADA. They are there to build the capacity, to train you, to provide the technical assistance that you need so that you can advocate for yourself or for others.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you for your answer.
That's one of the things that we try to remind people too. People come in and they want us to give them legal advice. And we have to remind people and sometimes remind ourselves that we are not a legal entity. We can't give legal advice. We can give information, and we can provide peer support. We can provide technical assistance, and that's where the Southeast ADA Center comes in, and that's why the partnership is so important. But we're not legal. We're not legal scholars. We're not lawyers or attorneys. We don't do that. And back to your question about the heroes of the ADA then and now, I think, and this is just my experience, and I think that we knew some giants in the community as far as the ADA is concerned. I know Frank Cherry was a wonderful advocate for people with disabilities, and I believe, and Cherie can back me up on this, I believe he was in the Rose Garden the day that law was signed. Another advocate for a person with a disability would be Warren Jernigan, who recently passed away in the last couple of years. You know, what he was able to accomplish over the course of many years for this community and the entire United States was pretty remarkable. And so I think it's all grassroots. I mean, we talk about Joe Mixon, and we all know who that is, but you know, he's a big fish in our community. And I think if everybody had a big fish in their community, you know, I think that's why this education is so important, so that everybody can take that information back to their community, back to the people that need to go out and do things and, you know, file the complaints, go out and look for the accessibility in programs and buildings, you know, and that's where you find your new heroes of tomorrow of the ADA. It's on a grassroots level, you know, educating people, helping them in their process, so that one day they can point and say, he's the reason that this law was passed, or she's the reason that this got done. And it does, you know, not to borrow a phrase, but it does take a village to do that. It doesn't just happen overnight, but we have to pass that torch, you know. Frank and what they did was remarkable, but we have to be able to pass that torch on to some new folks who can pass along that information and continue to learn, continue to grow, and be that mentor for the next generation. And if we do that, then we're not really doing ourselves any favors. So I know that's a long, drawn out.
No, you're right about it. You're right. It's not always going to be people on the mainstream, you know, nationwide that we're gonna know. It's the people in the community. So you're right. You know, it's just, I guess we just hear the name so much. You know,
We just have to remember that those people had to start somewhere.
They were local. They were local too at one point.
Yeah.
You know.
And Danny, you're absolutely right. I have a picture of when the president signed the law, and a picture that I circled with a yellow ink where Frank Cherry was on the lawn. And Warren Jernigan was there that day as well. So, you know, these are names that are kind of like maybe embedded in our heads. They were our mentors. They were the people that got wet our whistle. And you know what? We look back now and we say, if I had known then what I know now. So it's a now and then kind of thing, and it's people like John Collins, it's people like Danny Broxson, it's people like Joanne and Susan that are going to take this back out in the community, and they're going to do it in a win-win fashion. I mean, yes, we have our grassroots advocates out there, and they're still needed, and but it's always better to have a winning situation. You said something else, too, about the law that I wanted to talk about, those gray areas, because somebody said something to me one time that kind of stuck in my head, that if we didn't have gray areas in the law, it couldn't be litigated. And that's what case by case means. It means that you could have the same case as me, but it's not the same. It's going to be litigated differently. So that's where those gray areas come in. That's how lawyers are able to pull out those areas and say, well, John's case is comparable to Cherie's case, and he's going to bring that case up, but he's going to win it for you.
Right. Right.
Very good. Thank you very much.
Well, we have no other questions, so I guess we are going to end our webinar. And I'm really thankful that everyone attended today and had really great discussion today. So I thought this was important. And I hope that anyone that is watching the recording in the future will really think about what we discussed today. And if they have further questions, they can go to ada.gov or to the Southeast ADA Center. Cherie, please put the link to the Southeast ADA Center in the chat box so that it's recorded there. And they can get more information. And if they have specific questions, they can submit an email there. Or, of course, contact the CIL of Northwest Florida and at info@cilnwf.org and send in your questions. So thank you so much.
Joanne, I'd like to say something before we wrap up and just reiterate. Thank you again for all of you who attended and gave up your time and everything. But I also want to say that if you like what you heard and want to know more, it would be helpful for us to know what you're interested in. So if you have a particular interest in, let's say, for example, the ADA, but you want to talk about specifics or employment, and you want to know more, and you want to do more of these presentations and attend more of these presentations, if you will let us know, that way we know what you want, and we can put out the information and the presentations that are most effective. And the only way we do that is by finding out what you want. Since we are consumer driven, since we are consumer controlled, we want to do things that are good for you and that are going to be beneficial to you in your journey, wherever you are in that process. So if you'll let us know what you think and what you might want to see in the future, that would help us in making these presentations and developing these things so that we're putting good stuff out there for you. So just want to throw that out there, and thank you again very much for coming.
Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful day. And that concludes our webinar.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.